Fascism, the third way that betrayed everyone. Fascism is probably the most misunderstood political phenomenon of the 20th century, not for lack of information, but for an excess of mythologies. The left presents it as the most extreme form of capitalism, the right as an aberration alien to their values, and the center as an inexplicable collective madness. All these explanations fail because they ignore fascism's most disturbing nature. It was a genuine mass movement that arose precisely from the contradictions of the liberal democratic system, and offered a solution that millions of people considered attractive. To understand fascism, we must abandon traditional political categories and see it for what it really was. The first modern experiment in authoritarian mass politics in developed industrial societies. 1. The origins. When democracy wasn't enough. Italy, the original laboratory. Fascism was born in Italy not because Italians were especially evil, but because Italy was the weak link of European democracies. The country had arrived late to unification in 1861, late to industrialization, and late to World War I. When the war ended in 1918, Italy was in a crisis that combined all the elements that would later be seen in other countries. Unsustainable foreign debt, galloping inflation, massive unemployment, war veterans without prospects, and a political system that seemed incapable of solving basic problems. Benito Mussolini, an ex-socialist expelled from the party for supporting the war, understood something that traditional politicians didn't grasp. The masses wanted action, not parliamentary speeches. They wanted concrete enemies, not complex economic analyses. They wanted to belong to something great, not be treated as atomized individuals in a market. In March 1919, Mussolini founded the Fasci di Combattimento in Milan. The name was perfect. It evoked both unity and violence. The original program was a bewildering mixture that included universal suffrage including women, 8-hour workday, worker participation in industrial management, abolition of the Senate, republic instead of monarchy, progressive tax on capital, and confiscation of ecclesiastical property. This program was more radical than that of many European socialist parties. What was fascist about it? The methodology. Everything would be achieved through direct action, organized violence, and mass mobilization under a charismatic leader. 2. The mechanics of power. How the fascist machine works. The conservative revolution. Fascism solved a seemingly impossible contradiction. How to make a revolution that didn't change the fundamental structures of economic power. Fascists promised radical change while reassuring economic elites. The formula was brilliant in its cynicism. Mobilize the masses with promises of social transformation. Reassure elites by promising order and discipline. Destroy the left that represented the real danger for both groups, and create a strong state that would mediate between capital and labor under fascist control. The permanent enemy. Every fascist regime needs a permanent enemy. Not occasional, but permanent. Because fascism is not a government program, It's a state of constant mobilization. In Italy they were the real or imaginary Bolsheviks, the Pluto-Democrats representing Western democracies, and the different like ethnic minorities and political dissidents. In Germany they chose Jews as the perfect scapegoat for being few, visible and successful, in addition to communists and degenerates, which included everything from modern art to homosexuals and disabled people. The enemy must be simultaneously all-powerful to justify extreme measures, and pathetically weak to guarantee victory. This logical contradiction doesn't matter because logic isn't the point. Emotional mobilization is. The aesthetics of power. Fascism understood something that liberal democracies ignored. Politics is theater. People don't vote only for economic programs. They vote for emotions, for belonging to something, for feeling important. Fascists invented modern political spectacle with uniforms that made everyone equal, important and warriors, symbols like the Roman fasces, the swastika and the eagle that evoked ancestral power, rituals like marches and rallies that created a sense of community, architecture that made the individual feel small and the state feel great, and propaganda through posters, films and radio in the first massive use of modern media. 3. The fundamental contradictions. Elite support. The great lie of fascism was that it was a popular movement against the elites. In reality, it came to power because conservative elites believed they could use it for their own ends. In Italy, King Victor Emmanuel III appointed Mussolini prime minister in 1922, not because fascists had a majority, but because conservatives thought they could control him. Industrialists financed fascism because it promised to discipline workers. In Germany, conservatives around Hindenburg made exactly the same calculation in 1933. We can use Hitler and then get rid of him, they thought. Franz von Papen famously declared, "In 2 months we'll have him cornered so much he'll squeal." They were all wrong. Fascism wasn't an instrument that could be used and discarded. It was a force that once unleashed, transformed everything it touched. Reactionary modernity. Fascism was simultaneously ultramodern and ultra-reactionary. It used the most advanced technology like radio, cinema, aviation and chemistry to promote pre-modern ideas like leader worship, mystical nationalism and natural hierarchies. Fascists adored machines but hated rationalism. They loved speed but despised progress. They promoted efficiency but destroyed meritocracy. This contradiction wasn't a defect of fascism, it was its essence. It offered the benefits of modernity without its psychological costs like individualism, competition and uncertainty. 4. Fascism and power. The reality behind the propaganda. Coordination. Once in power, fascism didn't abolish existing institutions. It emptied them of content and filled them with its own logic. In Germany, this was called Gleichschaltung or coordination. Unions, universities, churches, media, even sports clubs, everything had to coordinate, with party objectives. It wasn't necessary to prohibit everything. It was enough to ensure that each institution had fascist leaders, followed fascist lines, and expelled unreliable elements. The fascist economy. Economically, fascism was neither capitalist nor socialist in the classical sense. It was something new. State capitalism directed by political objectives. Companies remained private, but the state decided what to produce, at what prices, with what materials, and for what markets. Profits remained private, but strategic decisions were state-controlled. This worked temporarily because it allowed combining business efficiency with state planning. But it was unsustainable in the long term because it subordinated economic logic to political logic. War as destiny. All fascist regimes ended in war because war was the only solution to their internal contradictions. Permanent mobilization needed real enemies. Promises of national greatness needed concrete victories. The directed economy needed objectives that justified sacrifices. War wasn't an accident of fascism, it was its inevitable destiny. 5. Why did it work? The reasons for initial success. The vacuum of alternatives. Fascism triumphed where liberal democracies seemed impotent, and socialist alternatives seemed threatening. In the interwar crisis, traditional parties offered limited options. Liberals promised more of the same with free market and parliamentary institutions. Conservatives wanted to return to the past with monarchy, tradition and social hierarchy. Social Democrats proposed gradual reforms that seemed insufficient, and communists threatened total revolution that terrified the middle classes. Fascism offered a fifth option: nationalist revolution that promised change without threatening private property, modernity without liberalism, community without socialism. The psychology of the masses. Fascism understood something fundamental about human psychology. Most people prefer certainty to freedom, belonging to autonomy, action to deliberation. In societies in crisis, it offered certainty instead of democratic doubt, community instead of competitive individualism, purpose instead of liberal relativism, and action instead of parliamentary debate. It wasn't irrational to support fascism if what one valued was order, security, and group belonging. The charismatic factor. All successful fascist movements had charismatic leaders who embodied their followers' aspirations. Mussolini represented the Italian who had been humiliated by the great powers, but would now claim his place in the world. Hitler represented the German who had been betrayed by liberal elites, but would now build a 1,000-year empire. Charisma wasn't just personal, it was historical. These leaders seemed to embody their nation's destiny. 6. The collapse. Why fascism self-destructs. The logic of radicalization. Fascism couldn't stop because its internal logic demanded constant radicalization. Each success demanded a greater success. Each defeated enemy required a more dangerous enemy. In Germany, this led from legal anti-Semitism in 1933 to the Holocaust in 1942. In Italy, from the conquest of Ethiopia in 1935 to the suicidal alliance with Hitler in 1940. Structural incompetence. Despite propaganda about efficiency, fascist regimes were structurally incompetent, because they subordinated technical competence to political loyalty. The German fascist state was a chaos of competing agencies, overlapping jurisdictions, and bureaucratic struggles. It functioned in war only because it could plunder resources from occupied countries. Total war. The war that fascism needed to justify its existence ended up being the war that destroyed it. Fascists understood politics as war, but didn't understand war as logistics. They could mobilize masses, but couldn't sustain modern armies against industrially superior coalitions. 7. Lessons for the present. Can fascism return? What is not fascism? Not all authoritarianism is fascism. Not all nationalism is fascism. Not all populism is fascism. Classic fascism required specific conditions. Crisis of liberalism, mass mobilization, alliance with conservative elites, ideology of nationalist revolution, militarized aesthetics, and war economy. Contemporary conditions. Do conditions exist today for a new fascism? Partially. We see crisis of legitimacy of liberal institutions, extreme polarization, fragmented media, growing economic inequality, and mass migrations generating identity reactions. But there are also important differences. No economic crisis comparable to 1929. Global elites have fewer national ties. Modern armies are professional, not conscripted. And historical memory of fascism acts as an antibody. The real threat. The danger is not the exact repetition of 1930s fascism, but the emergence of new forms of authoritarianism that combine fascist elements with contemporary conditions. This could include authoritarian populism with electoral support, use of social media for mobilization, alliances with technology corporations, economic nationalism in globalized economies, and militarization of domestic politics. 8. Conclusion. The permanent warning. Fascism wasn't a historical accident or an inexplicable aberration. It was a political response to real crises of the liberal democratic system. And those crises can repeat themselves. The main lesson is not that it never again can happen, but that it can happen in new and unexpected ways if democracies don't resolve the contradictions that originally gave life to fascism. Fascism promises to resolve the tension between freedom and order, between individualism and community, between efficiency and justice. It always lies, but always finds audiences willing to believe the lie. The best defense against fascism is not nostalgia for 20th century liberal democracy, but the construction of forms of political organization that offer what fascism falsely promises: real community, shared purpose, and democratic control over the economic and technological forces that shape our lives. Because fascism will continue to be attractive as long as democratic alternatives seem impotent in the face of real problems of real people.